Greetings to everyone. My affectionate pranams to all my Vaishnava sisters and brothers who have come here today to Bird's Eye View with Garuda on the topic of BBT editing reviewed. So I'd like to just mention a couple of practical things. One is that you will not be audibly acknowledged. In other words, no one can hear one another on this video meeting. And in the chat box, you'll be able to write questions or comments anytime, but they will not be publicly seen. They will only be seen by our host, or co-host. So just to let you know, this is to be able to manage a large group because we're expecting quite a few people. So the format would be roughly about 30 minutes of my presentation and roughly 30 minutes of Q&A, comments, and so on. So I'm delighted that you're here. This is the first of Bird's Eye View with Garuda. And I'll just say a quick something about the title of our series, Bird's Eye View. It's even though it's a little cute and a little catchy, perhaps, and relevant to a figure like Garuda, it's meant to indicate that we're trying to look at aspects of the philosophy and practice of Krishna Bhakti in a broad-minded way. So I'm going to share my screen, and all of you can follow along my various images and text. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to share the screen now. And here we go. Okay. So, so Bird's Eye View with Garuda Das. This will be a new platform providing monthly talks, presentations, discussions, etc. And before the monthly meeting, we'll announce what it is, perhaps with whom I would be engaged in a dialogue, etc. I'd like to offer special thanks to Premananda Vilas Das, who's involved with the production and hosting of this meeting, Keshihanta Das in consultation, also Krishna Kanta Dasi and Paratrikananda Das. All of them have been very, very helpful to me. Now, putting the editing of Srila Prabhupada's books in historical perspective from this bird's eye, okay? So it's not from the big Garuda, it's from the little tiny eeny-weeny Garuda that's pictured here, okay? So obviously, I'm referring to rather my effort to have a bit of a bird's eye view. Before we move on, though, I'd like to make an announcement that coming soon will be a video series on the Acharya's copyrights. This will be offered by a very qualified attorney on the subject. The time will be announced and the place will be announced, but I'm very excited about this series that will be presented. And he's working on finishing his first installment, and I will let all of you know somewhere, I think on the YouTube channel, where this Bird's Eye View video will be posted, okay? Now, ladies and gentlemen, a year ago, literally a year ago today, on the 21st of February, I held a conference of 14 scholars in Berkeley, California at the Graduate Theological Union. You can see its logo here. at the Mira and A.J. Shingle Center for Dharma Studies. It was a symposium on a closed conference. It was not open for an audience, but it was a symposium on posthumous editing of a great master's works. Special focus on A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And it was a very successful conference. It was a wonderful conference. All who had attended had a great experience. And the presentations from that conference will be published in an academic volume. I'm currently putting all the papers together, and it's going out for consideration to a major academic publisher. So much of what I draw from here, ladies and gentlemen, in this introductory, but mostly in the following installments of BBT Editing Reviewed, will be information and confirmation and corroboration that I received from conducting such a conference. It was a wonderful conference and very edifying on the subject. Here's where it was held, right here in the Berkeley Hills. This is the main library and center for the Graduate Theological Union, and the University of California, Berkeley, is right behind it, right behind it. And the two institutions have reciprocity. They're virtually the same. Well, without even planning the date of this conference myself, the date that was available to start this conference last year, literally 1 year ago exactly to the day, it was the day on which our dear godbrother Shravananandaji was born. And you can see his dates of birth. He was born in 1953, and he passed away about 1.5 years ago. I only knew Shravanananda for about 1.5 years, 2 years. He was so encouraging and so intensively interested in seeing the issues surrounding the BBT editing addressed. And every other day I would get a call at about 7:30 in the morning from Shravananandaji, urging me to continue on and make this meeting in Berkeley happen. And he was greatly instrumental, along with his very sweet wife, Ananda Gopi. They were instrumental in making this meeting happen. So I dedicated the symposium to him, and I dedicate today's talk as well to him on his birthday. I can't talk about it too much because it's too moving to me, but his last spoken words were to me as he was in the hospital in an emergency, dealing with a cancer that was taking over his whole body. His last words to me was to thank me for helping to preserve Prabhupada's books. And he said he had to go. So his last dying words and his last seva to Prabhupada's movement was this issue on BBT editing. Here's the conference, the conference participants. And I want to also dedicate today's talk to a godbrother who was pictured there on the far left, Bhutatmaji, whose service was also to look into the BBT editing, and it was the last service he would conduct prior to leaving this world, which he did just a few months ago. He was a wonderful, wonderful devotee whom I only had the chance to meet and know over the past couple of years. He was a writer for BBT back in the day. He wrote and contributed to some of those small books, I believe Reincarnation, and so on. There's little books that devotees like to pass out. He was co-author in many of them with Mukunda Maharaj. These devotees are extraordinarily dedicated and fixed in Krishna Bhakti. As the Bhakti Sutra states, in a sutra I've translated here, may it be so, for when one is firmly fixed and very strong in Bhakti, the teachings on Bhakti are preserved and protected. And especially when Srila Prabhupada says that the way we can stay connected to him is through his Vani. The editing of Prabhupada's books and his words is no longer the private or isolated affair of a few doing a seva. This is a matter that impacts every single devotee in the movement now and in the future. And thus, I've been concerned about this issue, but you'll hear more about that later. A third person I want to honor is someone who just departed yesterday morning. And this is our dear friend and scholar, whom I've known for decades, Professor Thomas Hopkins. I've just put an article up on Dandavats about this. There'll be more on ISKCON News later. And he was a dear friend. I've circled here the Delhi Bhagavatams that Tom purchased in 1966 at 26 Second Avenue, when the movement was extremely young. And Krishnakanta and myself went up to his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we picked up his library. He wanted to give his whole library to me, and I was blessed and had no idea that I would be blessed with the original 3 Delhi Bhagavatams in mint condition, as mint as Indian published books can get. They're always a little rough and so on, but I'm sure they're exactly the way he received them when he originally purchased them. And there they are. Putting things in ISKCON historical perspective is what I want to do today. And when doing so, I'd like to go back to 1972. That's when the Bhagavad-gītā As It Is, that's when it was published by Macmillan. And I became a bhakta in 1972. So I actually saw fresh boxes of these books first coming out in softcover. At least that's all I saw then. The book did come out in hardcover. I have a hardcover version of the 72 version back then. But this is when the Bhagavad-gītā As It Is was published. When it came out, it was a glorious event. It was amazing. We loved the thickness of the book, and there was so much to study and read. And you have to remember that back then, we had the Krishna books, we had teachings of Lord Chaitanya, we had the small Bhagavad-gītā. Of course, I wasn't reading the small Bhagavad-gītā. I hadn't arrived at that point in those years. And then finally the Bhagavad-gītā. Of the 3 first volumes, of course, of the Bhagavatam were published. So when the Bhagavad-gītā came out, it was an extraordinary event. I can remember it clearly. And here's a very worked and well-read picture of, or I should say, very read Bhagavad-gītā As It Is pictured here. We have about 6 here in our home from the old days. In 1976, I used the Bhagavad-gītā As It Is at the University of Chicago when I first attended there. I was admitted to the doctoral program, and many colleagues were intrigued by my presence there because it was obvious I was a devotee. Why? Because I went clean shaven with a very long shika that was curled up into a hangman's noose, and I would go in kurta and pajama and tilak. I do have a picture somewhere of my university card, but I couldn't find it in time to post it here. But my peers and professors knew I was a devotee from Prabhupada's movement, and they were all very eager to read the Bhagavad-gītā. Again, the 72 Gita was not that well known in the academics yet, but I tried to make it more known at the University of Chicago. And so when I did hear some complaints from my peers about some, proofreading mistakes, some spelling mistakes. I didn't hear any complaints about the translations. I didn't hear any complaints of any major sort, but I, heard about quite a few proofreading mistakes. And I believe I contacted, Rameshwar at some point in a year or two later about that. And it suggested that perhaps in another printing, they could correct the spelling mistakes and do a little more careful proofreading. In 1977, before all that happened, I sent my master's thesis from the University of Chicago that was on the Chaitanya Charitamrita to Srila Prabhupada with a cover letter. And then Srila Prabhupada would leave this world about 5 months later. So that occurred in 1977. And in 1979, I should say that after 1977, I was publishing articles with Back to Godhead magazine, just a few, I'd say about 3. And so I got to know the devotees in the Philadelphia BTG house, because in 1977, I began my studies at Harvard. And Harvard is only like 5-hour drive north of Philadelphia. So I would drive, and my parents and my folks, relatives lived in Washington, D.C. So I would travel through Philadelphia, stop in, say hello to Satsvarup Maharaj and Jayadvaita Maharaj and Dravida and other devotees working with the, I believe Yamaraj was there then, a recently deceased godbrother of ours. I would stop by and I would see what was happening. And again, I would publish a few articles. And so I was friendly with the staff, and I enjoyed the Sangha as I came through that long drive, break up the long drive, and then I would head toward Washington after being in Philadelphia. So in 1979, this is when I was spending, I had been at Harvard for 2 years at this point, and spending a third year finishing up a second master's degree. It was in 1979 that I received a call from Jayadvaita Swami. He called me up and he said, I just thought I'd let you know that I'm editing Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gītā As It Is. And I sort of just assumed that this was to address the problems that I brought up with Rameshwar at the time, being a little disturbed that my colleagues were finding all kinds of proofreading mistakes. And so I said, well, this is great news. That's great. So you're going to fix all the mistakes, the spelling, the this, the that, and the other. He said, well, yes, but I'm doing a lot more than that. I said, what do you mean a lot more than that? He said, I don't know what a lot more than that means. He said, well, if you want to find out, why don't you come down and see what I'm doing? And so I decided, well, yes, then why don't I do that? So I traveled down. I was a little concerned what was going on. So I spent 3 days, I think it was 3 days, with Jayadvaita, Ravindra Swarup, who was then temple president of the Philadelphia temple. And we spent 3 days in a room just looking over every verse, pretty much the verses, I believe. I think we went into the purports as well, but in any case, Jayadvaita had, I believe, a typed draft of Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gītā As It Is, where he was making some editing changes and so on and so forth, indicating some editing. But it was only up through the 6th chapter, I believe, as I remember. And therefore we stopped after the 6 chapters because he says he doesn't have any drafts after that. We went through those 3 days, and essentially what I came to a conclusion was that Jayadvaita was essentially de-Hayagrivizing Prabhupada's Gita. And I figured, well, maybe that's better. I see that Prabhupada wrote one thing, Hayagriva changed it and, edited it, and it became another thing. Jayadvaita then was taking what Hayagriva did and reversing it back to Prabhupada. At least that was his aim. And I basically said, before I left the BTG house, I said, well, you know what? Basically, I see your process as a de-Hayagrivization of Prabhupada's Gita. That's what I see you doing. And I said it sort of neutrally. I didn't know whether I was glad about it or not glad about it. It seemed right. After all, Jayadvaita was an editor in Prabhupada's presence. And what could be better than Prabhupada's original words? So it made sort of sense. But not one time did a discussion arise about Prabhupada's instructions for the editing of his books. Not one word came up about that. Not from Jayadvaita, and nor did Ravindra Swarup or I inquire, well, what is Prabhupada's desires for his books? We were sort of on our own, trying to make Prabhupada's Bhagavad-gītā better, not only correcting some issues that were mistakes or whatever that would be ordinarily, conventionally accepted proofreading corrections, but we were really sort of trying to return Prabhupada's published Bhagavad-gītā, the one he published, signed off on, signed a contract for. We were changing it, back to Prabhupada, or as the BBT edit.com slogan is, closer to Prabhupada. I'm not sure why it's closer to Prabhupada. Maybe it should be called exactly Prabhupada, because if we're so sure that Prabhupada wrote this, then maybe it should be called exactly Prabhupada. But we'll get into those issues later in another session. I want to give the historical perspective. Now, after Prabhupada left this world, the movement was in a tailspin. The devotees didn't know how to put on the brakes and contemplate Srila Prabhupada's wishes for management, for spiritual leadership, and ecclesiastical issues like initiation, shiksha and diksha continuations. The movement was in a bit of turmoil, and there was a desperate fear that the movement would just sort of drop away or die away, I think. And suddenly we had these 11 acharyas. And they imputed to them, each of them was a kind of absolute authority that was over and above even the GBC. And Prabhupada never said that that is the way it should be done. And initiation and the continuation of the Guru Parampara was frankly a very casual discussion right toward the end. What was more a matter for Prabhupada was his establishment of the GBC and the BBT. But suddenly, this kind of imitation of Prabhupada was a preoccupation. And what came along with it is a sense of absolute authority. And I'm afraid that some of that spilled over a bit with the BBT editing. But I have to say, initially, quite innocently at first, I feel, with Jayadvaita Swami. I feel he really did his best, given the day, to try to, well, to serve Prabhupada's books. It's just that he wasn't professionally informed. And for that matter, I'm not sure he was completely devotionally informed in this new setting of being without Prabhupada's presence, without the author present. And so this is really, this was the challenge. Here we are, a book that has, many proofreading mistakes, and to Jayadvaita Swami's mind, was not authentically Prabhupada, but was Hayagriva. As you'll see, the problem is, at least I don't see it as a problem, but I think Jayadvaita Swami saw it as a problem, that it was Hayagriva that we were reading, or Hayagriva's version in places of Prabhupada's Gita that we were reading. But apparently Prabhupada liked it. Prabhupada authorized it. Prabhupada desired it. It is no coincidence that the first devotee Prabhupada would meet in New York would be a devotee with a master's degree in English, teaching at a university. I mean, what an amazing arrangement that was. I mean, who could have arranged that but Krishna? So while this editing was going on, I didn't have much more to do with it after that 3-day meeting in Philadelphia. Except one day, now I was at Harvard for 3 years, and then I returned to the University of Chicago. And I was under the tutelage of Edward C. Dimmock Jr., because my other main professor, J.A.B. Van Buitenen, or Hans Van Buitenen, had passed away while I was at Harvard. So Edward Dimmock was my doctoral advisor. And if any of you know what it means to get a doctorate, your doctoral advisor becomes that person upon whom you are utterly dependent for carrying through fully your work as to the PhD. So what happened in 1980-81, I was back in Chicago. The temple had moved from Evanston to Lunt, I believe it's called Lunt Street, if my memory serves me. And the devotees there were very fired up. I mean, a lot of devotees there. I remember Vaisheshka was there, Tripurari was there, Divyanga, I think was his name. There are other devotees, Govinda. Anyway, there was a bunch of really, really very inspired, fired up devotees going out to O'Hare Airport. And as you may know, O'Hare Airport is an international airport that conducts flights all over the world. I mean, at the time, it was the busiest airport in the world. Now, I think it's a little bit different. I think Atlanta may be the biggest one, or Dallas, Fort Worth, maybe. Anyway, but Chicago O'Hare Airport was just the busiest airport at the time. Even the supersonic jets that were around used to come into Chicago, as well as Kennedy in New York. Well, at the time, what was being practiced was a technique in book distribution of taking advantage of customers. It was called the change up. And back in the day when I used to live in Washington, D.C., and I was part of the ashram there in 73, 74, there was a devotee who represented BBT who traveled all around America, showing devotees essentially how to cheat people out of the money that they were offering for a donation for books on a book distribution. Well, devotees were very successful at it. This devotee held seminars at all these temples across America. I refused to do that. And devotees in the temple in Washington at the time, this was not the original Damodar, who was temple president before, but it was a later devotee who was temple president. They heard that I refused to do the change up out on Sankirtan, and they kicked me out of the temple. They didn't exactly kick me out of the temple. Back then, it was like temples used to trade devotees. There were negotiations, a sort of a slave trade, if you will. So so I was traded for another devotee in Philadelphia, and that Philadelphia devotee came to Washington. And that's where Ravindra Swarup was temple president. And that's how I got to know Ravindra closely. And so, but back to 1981, that change up was still, from 74 and 75, that change up was still a very intensive practice among some of the biggest book distributors. And this was going on at O'Hare Airport. One day I walk into the department at the University of Chicago, the Department of South Asian Civilizations, Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. And Edward Dimmock was down the hall, and he saw me come up the stairs and enter the hallway. And from afar, he said, Graham, he kind of motioned to me, Graham, would you come here, please, in my office? And I could tell there was something wrong. And he had me sit down at his desk. He said, would you please sit here? One of the funny things you should know about Ed Dimmock, he smoked like a chimney. And even though it was like smack dab in the winter, in Chicago winters are extremely cold, he knew I hated cigarette smoke. And I knew that he couldn't stop smoking. So in the middle of the winter, Professor Dimmock and I, whenever we would meet for an hour and a half or so, we both have our winter clothes, garments on. I mean, even scarf and everything. And I would open the window to allow the smoke to leave the room so I wouldn't suffocate and die. So this was one of those days. And he said, please read these 3 letters. So these were letters that Ed Dimmock received from extremely upset recipients of Prabhupada's books in O'Hare Airport as they were traveling through, from devotees who had cheated them of $20, $40, $50 or something each. And they felt violated. And they wrote, these letters were rants about how violated they felt. How could you represent or write a foreword in a book for an institution that makes it a policy to cheat people as they're traveling? Now, of course, I got the idea as I was, one page through the first letter, and I knew that the letters, the other letters, were going to be more of the same. And sure enough, while I pretended to be reading the rest of the letters, I am thinking, how in the world am I going to address this? Well, I stopped reading the letters. I appeared to be finished reading the letters. And I looked up at Professor Dimmock and I said, I am so sorry that you had to receive letters like this. And I said, what would you like me to do? He said, well, first of all, I never, allowed this letter to be published. Now, I had foreknowledge of the fact that Dimmock did sign permissions to have his foreword published in Prabhupada's Gita. And it turns out that Prabhupada Prabhupada had mentioned how much he really loved the foreword. But here was my doctoral mentor saying, red in the face, smoking up worse than he normally smoked. And he's very, very tense. And he's putting me on the spot. And I said, well, Professor Dimmock, I know the BBT, they're pretty professional about this. I'm sure they had some kind of document that you signed that allows them to publish it. And then he kind of remembered, yeah, he was kind of half drunk at a professional meeting when Rupanuga Prabhu asked him to sign off on the document with one or two changes that he made at the time. Maybe that was good, he was drunk. Maybe he wouldn't have signed it if he had not been drunk. In any case, Prabhupada loved the foreword, but here the foreword associates him as a scholar with the Krishna movement that cheated people. He said, look, okay, so maybe I did sign something that gives permission, but I would just wish that it would be removed. And I said, okay, I know the publisher. I'll see what I can do about it. So I called up Rameshwar and I told him what happened. And I said, what do you think about removing Dimmock's? As long as devotees are going to be cheating people, why bring Dimmock into it? I don't know. I told Rameshwar, I don't approve of the cheating. This has been going on for years. It's going to come back and hit us in the face. I think it already has. Proof, it was these letters. And he said Prabhupada loved it. Rameshwar is very loyal to Prabhupada. He said Prabhupada loved Dimmock's letter. So I could see that it wouldn't do any good for me to keep pressing this issue of the people who felt violated by it. So I tried another avenue, which worked. And I said, well, here's another thing for you to consider, Rameshwar. Show me a Bible or a Quran that needs a foreword. A sacred text of the Bhagavad-gītā, the third most read sacred text of the world, needs a foreword? It doesn't need a foreword. It's already a famous, famous, famous text. Maybe, a little review somewhere else with the other reviews, but not a foreword. It's almost an insult to the Bhagavad-gītā. He was so astonished by that reasoning that he actually took out the Dimmock's foreword. Mistakenly or unmistakenly, he took it out. That's how the foreword was removed from the Bhagavad-gītā as it is. I consider myself almost as responsible as Rameshwar himself because of my convincing argument. So I hold myself responsible for that and would like to undo that. Prabhupada liked it. It should be there in the book. BBT produced the first version of the second and enlarged edition of the Bhagavad-gītā As It Is. Who would have known that all the paintings would be changed out from the original? Who would have known that there would have been 7 or 8 subsequent different versions of the second edition? No one, could conceive of that in 1983. We thought 83 was like, okay, this is the new and improved, let's just go with it. In 1986, the BBT requested Jayadvaita to go around the world to defeat any devotees who did not accept the second edition. This is in the BBT minutes. Those BBT minutes, by the way, happen to mention myself, my name, along with Hridayananda Goswami's name, for evaluating future publications. It was in the same meeting in Dallas. I'm going to skip this and go to, I wrote an endorsement. I'm going to come back to this later. And I just want to show you some exact quotes from the document they call responsible editing. Peculiar title. It implies that there's been irresponsible editing, and perhaps that's what they're trying to correct. 1980 to 82, preparation. They were observing their own history. Gopi Purana Dana Prabhu suggested revisions for the Sanskrit. Jayadvaita Swami revised the English text. Revised. Notice that it's not edited, it's revised. The edited text and confirmed the Sanskrit revisions. Apart from meeting many times with Gopi Purana Dana Prabhu, he also conferred about the translations with Garuda Prabhu, Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, and others. Well, when he says Garuda Prabhu and Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, he is referring to that meeting in 1979. After that, I was never conferred with. 1982, GBC review. The GBC appointed a board of devotees to review the final revisions to the translations. The board included Satsvarup Das Goswami, Hari Shauri. By the way, everyone mispronounces his name as Hari Sari. The proper pronunciation is Hari Shauri. It's a beautiful name. Everyone mispronounces it. Even he mispronounces it, and other leaders. The board met for several days in Detroit and refined or approved the changes. Again, all this was being done on the basis of dehieroglyphizing and adjusting things according to scraps of transcriptions, of drafts, etc. And it was this effort to sort of revive the Dead Sea Scrolls. It almost felt like that. We're going back and we're trying to find the original Prabhupada. And it had that mood of a kind of misapplied historical critical method that we use in the academics for deriving an original text that had been lost, for which critical additions needed to be made and all this elaborate stuff. Again, we'll come back to that sort of thing later. Consultation with ISKCON leaders. Jayadvaita Swami widely distributed to ISKCON leaders a full list of the proposed changes to the translations, along with a letter asking for their comments. This is my point, ladies and gentlemen. Jayadvaita Swami did his best at the time. He was untrained. He has no college education. He's not a professionally trained editor. He's an autodidact, talented as he may be, but he had not a whole lot to work with except his inborn intelligence, of which he was endowed with much, in my opinion. But the problem was, not only did we not have professional training, we did not really first examine what were Prabhupada's desires for editing. And we looked over if the ISKCON leaders looked over his proposed changes at all, they did so without that knowledge. They assumed the authority, in a way, a kind of absolute authority, as were given to the 11 absolute gurus of the time, who are no longer considered absolute, as I think 8 or 9 of them have gone away. The ethos simply needed to kind of imitate the absolute authority that we felt with Prabhupada and tried to kind of reincarnate that in others that would follow after his departure. Well, I think this was happening with Jayadvaita Swami. As well-intentioned as his efforts may have been, and I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. However, I never heard any real sense of what it was that Prabhupada wanted. I think Ravindra and I just assumed that Jayadvaita knew that. Well, I want to end by quickly giving you a tour of the Macmillan Company, 866 3rd Avenue, New York, publishing contract between Prabhupada and their company. Here's a close-up. Okay, here's a close-up. It's for the Bhagavad-gītā As It Is, translated into English by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, an unabridged edition, approximately 1,000 pages and so on. I'd like to call your attention to Prabhupada's initializations. That's Prabhupada's initialization. Although this contract was written for Prabhupada, Rupanuga Prabhu at the time, very highly trusted senior Vaishnava and older disciple of Prabhupada, Satsvarup and Rupanuga were the older disciples at the time, I think along with Kirtanananda, who was also older. There were just a few, non-youth, essentially, back in the day. But anyway, he is also signing this. Whoops, let me get this back here. And you can see his signature, his initialization right here, okay? And here's Prabhupada's initialization. When changes are made to a contract, every change has to be initialized, okay? And that's what's going on here. So, I'm going to show you some more here. Okay, so here again, initialized, typed in change. And again, you'd see different things that have been crossed out, redacted, as they say, and again, double initialized. Okay, you can see in the margins, corrections and so on. But this is what I want to show you right here. And I'm going to give you a blow up of that. Oops, let's go to this one. Revisions only with the consent of the author. Yeah, okay, revisions only with the consent of the author. So Prabhupada signed all this in 1971 or 2, I think it was 1972, and initialized the changes and added this. He added this. No one else did. Not Rupanuga. He did. These other things also subject to author's prior approval. Such approval not to be unreasonably withheld. Subject to author's prior approval held, taking into consideration the blah, 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 blah. Okay, fine. Such translation to be subject to author's prior approval. Do you see how concerned Prabhupada was with his authority, as any author would have in writing their books? This is what I want to show all of you. And then finally, after first consulting with the author, Prabhupada's initialization. He was very concerned about being consulted for absolutely everything. Does that mean that any one of us, or even group of us, can start changing his books without his approval, without consulting him? These are the kinds of questions we're going to explore. So you can see here that he signs off, and I blocked Rupanuga's social security number, so you can't see it, but here's Prabhupada's visa number or something to that effect. And Prabhupada signed. Again, the two initialized here and so on. It's quite a document. So this is the first installment, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted you to gain a little bit of a history from my bird's eye view. And of course, that's limited, and I might be able to have others come on into this forum and to dialogue with them about that past history. I understand that we did the best that we could do at the time. I only had 3 years of graduate education. I wasn't even close to earning my doctorate. I wasn't even close to publishing all the 100 pieces of published work that I've done. I had not experienced what it means to do posthumous editing and publishing, as I did for our beloved Tamal Krishna Goswami and his book, his last book, his doctoral dissertation. We didn't have those experiences. So this is part one, and we will eventually do part two, probably in a month, and we'll send out notice. So I'm going to take this off of share, and Premananda Vilas will read or come on to voice or even visual and ask questions that he's receiving in the chats.
Thank you, Garuda Prabhu. So the first question that we have here asks, how does the BBT respond to this point that Srila Prabhupada only wanted revisions that were authorized by him?
How does the BBT respond to the point that Prabhupada wanted revisions only authorized by him?
Right. Okay.
They, by the way, I'm sensing a bit of a hum on your end, Premananda Vilas, okay? The BBT, the persons who are directing the BBTs around the world, who have done amazing production. My hat goes off to the book distributors who are not cheating customers, and I think that's long gone by now, I'm hoping. And my hat goes off to the BBT for extraordinary publication power in the sheer number of books and the quality to some degree. I sometimes it depends on which book, but generally speaking, it's an amazing, it's an extraordinary feat. However, here's the problem I've come up against. Somehow the BBT feels themselves empowered to know what good editing is. They have no idea. They have good sense. I mean, you know, many of these BBT directors are very intelligent devotees, but this doesn't make them capable of editing or knowing what proper editing is, even professional editing, even what is acceptable conventionally. And until a few years ago, I don't think any of them really looked seriously at Prabhupada's instructions for editing. And even now, I'm not sure they have. Again, there's a kind of sense of divine entitlement, which I find very peculiar. And I don't know what to do with that. One of the BBT directors, when I went to Tirupati to present to the GBC my concerns about the editing, one of them, I sat down with one of them and I said, look, you know what? We don't agree on most things, but you know, we're friendly. We you know, have affection for one another and we can talk to one another, and that's so important. But at least we could start at the beginning, right? We know that Prabhupada authorized the Macmillan Gita. And he immediately said, no, I don't believe he did authorize it. Honestly, I went into a bit of a shock. I mean, I think it's obvious why to all of you here, why I would have assumed safely that he could accept that Prabhupada authorized his own book, from which he spoke at least 250 lectures over the course of 5 years. He only spoke about 3 changes he wanted to have made in the Gita. Only 3. And we're talking thousands of changes by Jayadvaita Swami. So the for decades, I was aware, honestly, and I'll confess this to all of you, I was aware that devotees were aching over this issue of book changes. I was a good friend of Jayadvaita's for a long time, and I trusted him. But I'm not sure it's proper to trust anyone with something like the editing of Prabhupada's books, where all of us are so impacted. And, to give Jayadvaita Swami credit, he tried to go to the GP. He didn't try, he did. He went to the leaders. He went to the BBT people at the time. The fact is that none of us really knew what we were doing. I walked out of that 3-day meeting saying, okay, well, you're not just correcting mistakes, you're dehieroglyphizing the Gita. I guess that's better. I wasn't sure. I went out scratching my head. I wasn't sure, but I didn't know enough to object. It doesn't matter who assists an author in his or her work. Once an author signs off on that work and publishes that work, no one else is responsible for that work, nor can anyone change that work. That is the moral, rights of an author. And this has not been respected with Prabhupada. Let me put it this way. If Prabhupada if Prabhupada's book, Bhagavad-gītā As It Is, were resubmitted to Macmillan, if it were still being published by Macmillan, and Jayadvaita Swami had made all the changes that he made, they would not allow it. Why? Because the author is not here to accept it or not accept it. So, because this is an in-house publisher, BBT, suddenly we have the right to do whatever we want with Prabhupada's precious Vani? I think not. The short answer to this, or response from me, is I have not gotten good reception from the BBT. In fact, they don't regard me very much as an authority in this area, even though I'm probably more trained than just about anyone in the movement in this area.
Thank you, Garuda Prabhu. There are several questions here, and I'm going to take them in the order that they were received. There are also some comments, but I'm going to stick first with the questions. Srila Prabhupada did have his editors, including Jayadvaita Swami, edit his books and accepted their edits without specifically approving each and every editorial change. The contract with Macmillan was referring to Macmillan making the revisions. So as I see these the question in this comment, it is what's the difference between Prabhupada speaking to Macmillan in the contract versus speaking to his editors, whom he did actually give permission to edit his books.
Right. At the time, that was Prabhupada's prerogative to either look at every little thing or not look at every little thing. And frankly, we can't know exactly what Prabhupada was looking at. And it can appear one way to us. Maybe it's a different experience on Prabhupada's part. You don't know. Prabhupada is the authority. He never stops being the authority over his own books. So just because they were given provisional authority at the time to do the editing under Prabhupada's supervision doesn't mean that they can go on indefinitely doing editing, even changing, more than even editing, ad infinitum. For example, I assisted, it's no mystery, it's no secret that I was consulted at the very start of Jayadvaita Swami's own book, Vanity Karma. He came to me, he wanted to know how to write a book. Well, he comes already as a talented writer in his own right, and so I assisted him, and in the process of doing occasional consultations with me, he sent me drafts. I have on my computer right now drafts that he sent me, earlier drafts. Now, when Krishna takes him from this world, I don't think I have the right to go back into his drafts and say to everyone here, you know, when Jayadvaita was working on this, he actually did some better work here that I think we should change in a second edition. And I think this will be closer to Jayadvaita's, spirit, his devotional spirit. I think it'll be closer because I have it in his writing right here. I don't have a right to do that. Likewise, we don't have a right to go back into Prabhupada's works and to change what he has written. And you'll see that as in future installments here, you will see how firm Prabhupada was about no changes. He didn't want mistakes, but he certainly didn't want changes. So this we will explore further. So I appreciate the question.
So the next question that I have here is, what is your definition of dehieroglyphization?
Oh, so dehieroglyphization is simply that Jayadvaita would see where Hayagriva edited what Prabhupada originally wrote. Of course, we don't know what originally it is because we don't, there's a lot of speculation about what is an original manuscript. They keep talking about original manuscripts. If you ask them to produce an original manuscript, you won't get one. There are no original manuscripts. They're pieces of original or drafts, and we don't know how original those drafts are. It's messy. It's not a clean look. But what is clean is that Prabhupada signed a contract and submitted a manuscript. And every publisher sends back, and we don't have this. We looked into it. We tried to call Macmillan, or we consulted with Macmillan, but back in the day, as well as today, when a publisher as big as Macmillan publishes a book, and an author has to initialize every single page of changes. Presumably, it's a very safe assumption to assume that Prabhupada had signed every single page of the Bhagavad-gītā as it is for Macmillan. Dehieroglyphization is my own neologism, and it's basically what I saw Jayadvaita doing. But he didn't just take Hayagriva's edits out and return them to Prabhupada's. He put plenty of his own, what he thought were better ways of saying it than Prabhupada. There were plenty of those where he did not even consult a manuscript. In fact, where there were no manuscripts, of course, there or drafts, he couldn't return them to Prabhupada's original words. But even when there were drafts of Prabhupada's original words, sometimes Jayadvaita would take it upon himself to change the words in his book. So he would not only dehieroglyphize it and not only de-Prabhupadize it, if it's a terrible term, but he would put in his own writing, his own formulation of what would be better. We have evidence of that.
Thank you, Garuda Prabhu. There are a couple of questions here that to me sound like they're asking a similar question, so I will ask them both. BBT has assumed total authority. How would anyone be able to overcome their convictions? That's one question. And the other is, how do you propose we fix the problem and return to Srila Prabhupada's authorized version again?
Okay. I have solutions for this because I'm trained as a scholar. Prabhupada appreciated professionalism. All we've had in the movement is pseudo scholarship when it comes to publishing and editing, including myself at the time in 1979. What did I know? I mean, really, what did I know? But even I have probably more experience on posthumous editing, given that I put together a conference of 14 scholars from around the world, and I and I actually had the experience and the privilege of completing Tamal Krishna Goswami's doctoral dissertation when he was not around. I had to come to terms with what it means to honor an author who has passed away. And what a delicate process that is. The author is the authority. And I love that play on words because it's very didactic. The authority is the author. And the word author is embedded in the word authority. So this is where we need to start over. Today is a new day. Unfortunately, the BBT has politicized my involvement since 3 years ago. They've tried to paint a picture of me as moving into the ISKCON hater extremists. I don't hate ISKCON. I've been serving ISKCON for 50 years now. I've been a member of ISKCON for close to 50 years, just about 50 years though. I have endlessly supported ISKCON. I have been involved with the BBT in the 80s heavily. I was even funded by worldwide BBTs for 3 or 4 years to conduct a research in India on compiling a Vaishnava history, a history of Vaishnavism leading up to Prabhupada. And when Rameshwar left, that all fell apart. They did not continue it. I was left holding a $25,000 debt because the BBTs stopped continuing the funding. And even though I was encouraged to keep doing it and promised reimbursement, I took out a student loan. I was a graduate student. I took out a student loan with the confidence that I'd be paid back and that the project would continue. Well, it was cut off. I was left holding what became a $33,000 debt, student loan debt, which I just paid off last year. The BBT is embarrassed, I think, or they are embarrassed about being embarrassed, but they don't have to be. They have, since my and other devotee colleagues on this matter have gotten involved a few years ago. The BBT did meet with me in Washington, D.C. We had a wonderful meeting in many ways, although a lot of it backfired. They did not do some of the things they said that they would like to do. But since then, they have put together what do they call it? Revisions, revised revisions, editing, revised, something, I don't know, something convoluted, revisions editorial panel or something like that. And there are 3 academic devotees on that 7 devotee panel. And they're trying to apply more professional advice or guidance to the BBT. Do they have any power? Zero power, zero power. But are they respected? I believe they're respected, but I don't sense that the BBT really knows what to do. It's just beyond their pay grade. They don't know about editing.
Thank you, Garuda Prabhu. There is a question here that asks, do you make a distinction between published conversations and private letters sent to devotees from Srila Prabhupada that have been published by the BBT and Srila Prabhupada's books in terms of their editing?
Well, first of all, there would be no reason in the world to edit a letter that Prabhupada wrote. I mean, that would be absurd. mistakes at all. There are ways to indicate that there's a mistake in the original when you quote it, and you put a bracket, you put the letters SIC period, end bracket. And that shows that you, when you present the letter, didn't make a mistake in your presentation, but there was a mistake in the original presentation. So there are ways to indicate this, to make it very clear what is your mistake and what is the original author's mistake. Editing letters would be an absurdity. Those are private correspondences. There has been an attempt of the BBT to replace Jayadvaita's revised translations of the Bhagavad-gītā, the ones he did revise, which were many, to replace those in the books where Prabhupada was actually quoting his older translation. Let me see. I'm not sure I got that quite right. Let me see. Oh, yes. When there were transcriptions of Prabhupada's lectures, they didn't use the translation that Prabhupada was actually speaking from the 72 Gita, but then they replaced it with Jayadvaita's new translation, new and improved translation. I believe that that has been reversed, so it is true to what Prabhupada actually spoke. But this is what I'm talking about. There's been an aggressive need on the part of the BBT to establish the Jayadvaita revised and enlarged edition, even though there are about 7 or 8 different versions of it, different covers, different artwork, different ways of presenting. There's been a very aggressive attempt to establish it, even to pay for Jayadvaita to go around the world and defeat, not discuss, not dialogue, not educate, but to defeat. The word defeat was used in the BBT minutes, mind you, and this was in 1986. So already altercations and tensions were being built up from that time. So I asked the question, all these years, what is it that has caused such strife among devotees? Why are the devotees so upset about the editing? Well, I never looked into it. In the movement, we generally favor our friends instead of favoring the truth or favoring, Prabhupada. We'll enable all kinds of bad activities because we're friends, we're loyal friends. No, I don't do that. I've been a loyal friend to Jayadvaita Swami for decades, since the 70s, as I mentioned. But if I had to choose, I tried to remain his friend. He would not have it. He felt myself as being disloyal to him. I may have been stepping on his toes too much, and I'm willing to apologize for that. But I can never step down from what I learned about the editing that was done, and that what Dravida currently continues to do and feels he has a right to do. It's very alarming to me. And generally speaking, ladies and gentlemen, I have a very full life of wonderful, wonderful opportunities to do my own writing and publishing work with the likes of Oxford and Yale and Princeton and Columbia and other publishers. I have more on my plate than I can possibly handle. But when I see godbrothers like Shravananandaji speak his last dying words of gratitude that I am addressing this issue, he felt I was the only one who could really drive this home. And so he spent all his hours off work trying to help me do this. And his good wife, Ananda Gopi, as well. And others have expressed the same level of intensity that Shravanananda Ji has to me about the importance of preserving Prabhupada's Vani and following his instructions. When not following his instructions, I found out what is at the bottom of this. What is so disturbing to devotees are the kinds of conclusions you'd have to come to if Jayadvaita's editings were valid. The kinds of conclusions you'd have to make about Srila Prabhupada's person if you accept that Jayadvaita and Dravida know better what to do with Prabhupada's books than Prabhupada himself. We'll get to all of this. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but I'm trying to give you some sense of where I've been on this and where it's ended up. But I wanted to give you a sense today about the historical context. I really feel that Jayadvaita Swami sincerely tried to do his best, given no education, no training, a sincere desire to, I believe he really wanted to make Prabhupada look good to the scholars, look good and not be criticized. Was that Prabhupada's concern? Well, we'll find out. We'll find out what it was that was Prabhupada's concern. But, you know, none of us are here to make another person look better without their permission.
Thank you. There are several questions. One devotee would like to see some examples. I'm not sure if that's something you wanted to do in this presentation today. There is also a question about the BBT trustees, who they are and what their role is.
Okay. The latter question might be a bit beyond my pay grade. I don't really understand the legal and corporate structure of Bhaktivedanta Book Trust International. Did they get rid of the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust as a trust? Is there still a trust? Or do they still represent a trust? Is the BBT? This is beyond my pay grade. I did mention in the announcement that there will be a lawyer, an attorney, who will address the Acharya's copyrights. This is the person to whom you should place these questions. He will know. He will know. Now, the request to see examples. Let me tell you why that is a faulty request. Although I will present some examples, but let me tell you why that is there's a non sequitur there. You cannot appreciate the examples until, and I have to underscore this, triple underscore this, you cannot appreciate the examples until you appreciate what Prabhupada's desires were for editing, what his example was in the way of editing, without that, examples are useless. So first, we're going to talk about what Prabhupada's instructions were.
Thank you. I have two other related questions. One devotee asks, would a petition work? A petition presumably from the devotees to the BBT. And the other question, why do you think the BBT is stubborn about the editing? Is it because the BBT does not understand presentations like the ones you're making? I think Jayadvaita Swami trusts you as he sought your help with his book. Why can't he trust you now? So there are several questions in there, but they're about the BBT's trust in presentations such as these.
Right. Okay. So first of all, the only BBT director that still functions now that is a Prabhupada disciple is Nareshwar of Australia and Mayapur. All the other directors, BBT directors, are new, are after Prabhupada's time. They came around in the 80s. So in a way, they inherited this problem. So we need to give them a little bit of a benefit of the doubt. At the same time, the BBT created a kind of acrimonious atmosphere. That international BBT meeting at which Jayadvaita will go out and convince people. I'll read it directly to you here. I found it. In the resolution on November 30th to December 1st, 1986 in Dallas, Texas, resolution number 11, it stated Jayadvaita Swami will directly challenge and defeat the attacks, okay, they're considered these attacks, from certain quarters of the movement that the new edition of the Bhagavad-gītā put out by the BBT is not bona fide. He shall show from the original manuscripts, see how they talk about these original manuscripts like as if they're the Dead Sea Scrolls, how the editor of the book in the early 1970s distorted and changed Prabhupada's original words. So the picture they're painting here is that the early devotees cheated Prabhupada or ripped off Prabhupada or were so ignorant that they were, I mean, anyway, there's a sense in which, they feel like it was deliberate back in the day. And, Hayagriva's editings were deliberate, but Prabhupada trusted someone who had earned a master's degree in English. I mean, if you're an author and you bring in a master's degree instructor at a university, he was a teacher at Ohio State University, I believe, and he's, changing what you do and you like it, who can object to this? So the idea here is that the language here will directly challenge and defeat. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here as a society to challenge and defeat one another. Maybe Mayavadism, maybe scientism, maybe atheistic, dehumanizing scientism, maybe. We're not here to defeat one another. We're here to work with each other. If in the hearts of so many devotees there is pain regarding the changes in the Bhagavad-gītā, that's something we should listen to. One of the ways we know how Prabhupada is speaking to us is through the hearts of devotees. This should have said, Jayadvaita Swami will directly connect with those who are troubled by the Bhagavad-gītā and discuss what the troubles are about. He will seek to find new ways and better ways to understand perhaps what Prabhupada is trying to say to him through the hearts of these many, many devotees. That's what the a revolution is for sure. Resolution should be a revolution in the way this is worded.
There's some comments of appreciation here. Thank you so much for looking to Srila Prabhupada's intentions for his own books, even more valuable coming from a solid devotee and an expert in the field of textual analysis. I'm not aware that anyone listening has any pull here, but I trust it is being recorded, and at least this is raising awareness on such a vital topic. A similar comment, with tears in my eyes, I want to thank Garuda Prabhu. Shravanananda is listening gratefully. Ananda Gopi.
Premananda, do you want to address the issue of recording, what we're going to do?
Yeah, so we'll be recording this. We are recording this, and we'll be posting it to YouTube and posting that video onto the BBT Edit Review Facebook page.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So we have been on for quite some time, and I'm thinking that maybe this is a good time to close. And if we do close, I hope all of you will tell others about what we're trying to do here. We're not here to try to defeat anybody. We're not here to try to challenge anybody, but let's work together to bring up the higher standard for preserving Prabhupada's books. We know so much more now. Ladies and gentlemen, what did I know 45 years ago? Really? Even as a graduate student at University of Chicago and Harvard, I didn't know anything. I had no experience with publishers. Now I do editing and evaluation and peer review for Princeton and Yale and Oxford. And I know what they look for. I've engaged in dialogue with executive editors. To do this professionally, according to normal publishing conventions, it behooves us to achieve that standard on the one hand. But that is not in conflict with what Prabhupada desired for his own books on the other hand. And this is the journey I want to take all of you on. And of course, I will value your views, whatever they are. And let's see if we can't move things in the right direction. I think things are moving gradually in the right direction, but they really need to move faster. So we're here to do that. So I thank all of you very much for coming, and my pranams to all my Vaishnava sisters and brothers here. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Hare Krishna.